So our next speaker is Dr. Patterson from the University of Pittsburgh. She is a biostatistician and is going to be talking to us about nonpharmacologic interventions.
So good morning. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I see some familiar faces and then also seeing the trainees in person. So hopefully I get to talk with most of you before our visit here as well. So I was asked to talk about behavioral interventions, but most of my work is not necessarily behavioral, but been in the realm of non-pharmacologic interventions. And so wanted to talk with you today really about some design issues that came up in the course of these studies and really more of a lessons learned. So it's not entirely comprehensive about all non-pharmacologic interventions, but just some experiences that I've had in the past 15 years with some of the trials where I've been involved. So I'll talk about my experience with a few trials. I'll give you some suggestions around studies if you're proposing multimodal interventions. Briefly talk about usual care as a control in your study designs, and then also discuss the consort extension to non-pharmacological interventions, which is really important. I think could help some of you actually design your protocols now if you pay attention to what you have to report once your study comes out in JAMA or New England Journal. So all of us are very familiar with staging in drug trials. Early on in our research, in some of our courses in college, we were taught about phase 1 studies for dose and safety, looking at PK/PD. We also learned about phase 2 studies, looking at maybe short-term efficacy and additional safety outcomes. And then we also, of course, learned about phase 3 studies, which may be efficacy, but also may be effectiveness. And so this is in all clinical trials courses. It's probably the first lecture, just giving an overview of how these trials are staged and how you move forward. So as a practicing biostatistician, when I started working with people that were looking at exercise and physical therapy and mind-body interventions, all of that is out the window because there's no defined staging for interventions when you're not dealing with drug studies. So a lot of times, and I started my work as a biostatistician with a lot of K-12 career development award trainees, and so they're doing these very small pilot studies, but wanting them to look like phase 3 studies looking at efficacy and effectiveness. So the question always was, well, if you've done your pilot study, then what are how do you know when to move forward? And maybe if you do a small efficacy study, well, then what are the benchmarks for moving forward? And a large single center efficacy study, which is a lot of where the physical therapy folks that I work with do these single center studies. And very few of the interventions that I've worked on actually go into these big multi-center clinical trials where we would maybe call that more of the phase 3 and really looking at effectiveness. So I've always, anytime I've worked with investigators, I'm always trying to figure out where, if it's a non-pharmacological intervention, like what's the staging, where are we? So I'm going to talk to you about 5 studies that I've worked on that have had different issues with respect to study design and eventually what came out in the data. One was the SPARK study, which was funded by NINDS, looking at exercise and Parkinson's disease. I can remember being on conference calls at McDonald's when my kids were on spring break with all the investigators debating whether we should have a control group or not. So those kind of things haunt you over the years. We also had a study, a surgery versus physical therapy for spinal stenosis. So this is one where we got into this issue of just because you randomize someone to that arm doesn't mean that they would necessarily comply with it. Then I worked on a mind-body intervention for low back pain, and I'll just give you this abbreviation, IRGT, and I'll explain to you what that is. We also just finished up a study in physical therapy looking at people who just had knee replacement, and again, a little different because we had very motivated volunteers, and it's something for you to be aware of. I'll expand on that more. And then a current study that we're just getting up and running in 25 sites where we actually don't have a control group. So the exercise in Parkinson's disease study all started out when several investigators from University of Illinois Chicago, University of Colorado Denver, and also at Pittsburgh said, you know, there's been some really good animal work that showed that high-intensity exercise could decrease dopaminergic symptoms but more in the animal model. So this was a photograph given to me by Judy Cameron at the University of Pittsburgh, and I hope everybody in the back can see, but that's a monkey on a treadmill. And they had induced Parkinsonism in the monkey and then exercised these monkeys at very high intensities and then looked at dopaminergic activity in the brain. So we were basing our high intensity hypothesis in humans off of what was mostly at the time animal work. So this would have been in 2010, 2011. So the investigators came to me originally and said, we want to do a 2x2 factorial design. We're going to look at the difference in intensity, high intensity, low intensity, 2 days per week versus 4 days per week. We're going to look at 45 people per group, and the UPDRS score is going to be, the motor score is going to be our outcome, and we're going to look at de novos. And it came up with about a $14 million budget. So we went to NINDS, and they said, we do not fund small, underpowered efficacy trials. So you may hear some of your mentors and the faculty here say the same thing. Small, underpowered efficacy trials is not the goal. And you know, my colleagues, that's what they were used to doing, were these pretty small exercise single center studies of about 40 to 80 people. And so this is what they were used to. But we were moving into a new realm. And then I was just talking with Dr. Galpern. A colleague from NINDS said, it's just exercise. And we still joke about this comment because it actually turned out our trial had some positive results. So. And so this was me. I found this photograph totally by accident. But again, I can remember being on phone calls on a regular basis, just trying to figure out if we even needed a control group and what would that look like. This was not a typical Parkinson's disease trial where we could put people on placebo. So what we proposed was approximately a phase 2 study, because they also said to us, you don't even know if people will exercise at high intensities, if they can even get their heart rate up to what you're proposing. So our first question was, can we get them to 65 and 80% of their max heart rate? And does it warrant further investigation? So I did my homework and said, look, the studies that NINDS is funding now are called, that are phase 2, are futility trials. And we need to make this look like a futility trial and propose it as a futility trial so that it's rigorous in terms of the questions and the hypotheses, and it'll get approval by our peers. And so that's what we did. And then for our third aim, of course, we were monitoring for adverse events. People are going to be sore. There's a possibility of them falling on the treadmill. So that was something that we really needed to keep an eye on. So our PI came up with SPARKS, which we love, and that's the study of Parkinson's disease and exercise. So you have to come up with an acronym. I'm sure that your faculty have already told you that, but you have to come up with an acronym for your study by maybe, is it Will, is that a good, that's a good, by the end of Thursday. So again, looking at the futility trials that had been done to that point were mainly, they were all drug trials, not exercise studies. And so they mainly looked at placebo controls, historical controls, but then a couple of the studies were also looking at calibration, concurrent placebo calibration arms. And so we knew in Parkinson's disease that placebo, there was a placebo effect. So empowering the study, that wasn't really helpful for me because looking at a control group, we could not put people on placebo. We really needed a natural cohort. Now, at the time, that natural cohort didn't exist, although now we have really good data coming out from the PPMI, and so it's a little different now than it was then. So we ended up going with 4 days per week for 6 months, so a short-term outcome for this phase 2. And we had 3 arms, 65% of heart rate max, 80% of heart rate max. And we did a usual care, and we allowed people, if they were still eligible from a cardiovascular perspective at 6 months, to cross over, and they would be randomized to one of the high intensity or the moderate intensity. And that was really done for recruitment purposes. I mean, we wanted people to be able to eventually exercise with our exercise trainers, and so it was an incentive to get people to volunteer for the study. It answered our question, but then also was a good recruitment tool. So I don't know if you can see it in the back. I apologize. But what we found, the top line on the left-hand figure, that's the heart rate, the average heart rate for our high-intensity exercisers. And we're right at around the lower, we're supposed to be 80 to 85, we're right around the 80% mark. So we showed that over 26 weeks, people were hitting their target. So it's a feasibility question. And then we showed that the 60 to 65%, what was interesting is people had a hard time staying within the 60 to 65. They wanted to do more. So their average is up around 66. But we showed clear separation in the lines, which was our goal. And then on the right-hand figure, this is the number of days per week. Do you remember how many days per week they were supposed to exercise? 4. So the high-intensity group did about 2.8, and the low to moderate did about 3.2. So if you weren't doing too much, you were willing to do it a lot more, but if you had to do a lot, you didn't do it as much. Statistically, they weren't different. And then what made us really happy, and I'm sorry for the folks in the back, but we did see that we met our threshold, our futility threshold for the high intensity group compared to the usual care. And so that's highlighted in the blue box. We did not find that with the moderate intensity, so that 60 to 65 group. Now what's on the lower row is, our primary outcome was the UPDRS motor score. A secondary outcome was the MDS UPDRS motor score. And so we actually showed a significant more superiority. The p-value was less than 0.05 for the MDS UPDRS motor score when comparing high intensity to usual care. So we are now, we had basically a positive finding with our futility trial, and we're ready to move on to our phase 3. And now our question is, what do we do in phase 3? Because proposing to people, this paper got a lot of publicity. The American Physical Therapy Association had it on their website. There were advertisements. I can't remember how many hits our article has gotten. But my understanding is this has gotten a lot of press. We had even in Pittsburgh, I did an interview with the Post-Gazette. So I think it would be really challenging to randomize people to usual care now, especially if we want to go out to 12 months. So I won't tell you the secret because hopefully eventually we'll get funded, but we are going to propose a phase 3 study that's going to look a little different than what we did for the phase 2. This was a study looking at surgery versus physical therapy for people who had lumbar spinal stenosis. So the non-pharmacologic here is surgery versus physical therapy. And these were all surgical candidates. So these were people that presented at the surgical office. They had been screened and would have been able to get surgery, but were willing to be randomized to non-surgery. So we had a total sample size of 169. The primary outcome was physical function at 24 months. So for a surgery trial, this is really long follow-up. Now I put a disclaimer at the top that says I inherited this study, which means I'm not sure that I could have stopped what happened from happening if I would have been involved. But there was a lot of cleanup because I got the study about 4 years after it had been finished. And so there was a lot of work going into the analysis when it eventually got published. So what happened was that 57% of the physical therapy group eventually got surgery. So when you're trying to look at PT versus surgery, you essentially can't because over half of the people in the PT group got surgery. So when we submitted this to the Annals of Internal Medicine, which has a statistical review board, I got a very thorough discussion of what the difference between the effect of the assignment, the randomization, and the assignment to PT versus the actual effect of PT versus surgery. So it was a painful process, but eventually we had to do a causal effects analysis to see how robust our findings were. Now, I won't go into detail about what's on the y-axis, but I think even those in the back can see that the lines are on top of each other. Over 24 months, this is PT versus surgery. This is intention to treat in the figure, and we saw no difference between the groups over time. After doing the causal effects analysis with several different types of analyses, we also showed that there was no difference between the groups. So, as a statistician, even though, I was trained always on intention to treat, when you're presented with this problem, intention to treat really doesn't make sense anymore. Also, I went online to look at our article, and I noticed there's a caution on our article. So you don't want this, but there's a caution that says, half the patients in the PT group crossed over to receive surgery. And the implications are that if they were offered evidence-based PT, so there's that language, offered, not received, that they did about as well as the surgery group. So, I don't know, I just thought it was funny that our article had caution on it. But, you know, if I would have been involved earlier, is that something that we would have monitored, possibly maybe even the DSMB would have monitored, and maybe if something would have happened during the course of the study, I'm not sure, but we still managed to get published and did our best to analyze the results. So another study that I worked on, mindfulness meditation, which was a randomized controlled trial sponsored by NHLBI. We were looking at, I think it was NIH, I apologize, I'm not sure if it wasn't NHLBI because this was low back pain. I think it was NINDS. We were to determine the effectiveness of a mind-body program in increasing function and reducing pain among older adults with chronic low back pain. And so the investigator was really tuned into looking at older adults because a lot of studies hadn't looked at people 65 and older when it came to chronic low back pain. And she wanted to, of course, look at mindfulness meditation. The primary outcome was their function on this disability scale. Now, she had done a pilot study during her K-12 award to find out that the control group, you had to be very careful in designing it and basically not discuss pain in your control group. So we learned that in a pilot study that any kind of control that discussed pain and pain management would have an impact. Like, you know, they would change similarly over time, not necessarily P less than 0.05. So this study design was interesting in that each of the individual participants, once deemed eligible, would be randomized. So individual, randomized. But once they participate in the mindfulness meditation, that was in groups of 10. Okay? So they're in classrooms together and they go through, I think, 8 sessions. And the 10 keys, which was the control group, so this was healthy aging, basically. But that was also in a class setting. Okay? So individually randomized group treatment trials, IGRT. So here's what happens. You've got about 10 older adults per class for about 8 sessions and some booster sessions. So what happens in those 8 sessions? 10 sessions. They talk. Oh yeah. They have the same instructor. They're in the same cohort. So they're not mixing and mingling and dropping into whatever session is available. They're cohorted through. They have the same discussions. They're focusing on similar things, same questions come up, same time frame. And so what naturally occurs is you might expect that their outcomes might be more similar than maybe someone who's in another cohort coming up behind them. In fact, when this study was going on, the classes were held in the same building where I worked. And we had a shooting at Pitt while one of the sessions was going on. And those older adults are walking around looking at the statisticians, like, where do we go? And the statisticians were like, we don't know. But, you know, it's those types of things happen to all of them at one time. Okay? So from a statistical perspective, that's what we call clustering. So they have similar outcomes that you would not expect with people who are not in the same group. So statistically, I've treated this almost like a cluster randomized trial. So we're individually randomizing, but the treatment is actually occurring at a cluster, a cohort level. So without going into too many details, it has an impact on sample size. So the more similar they are in terms of outcomes, then the more of them you would actually need, and the more of the clusters, the more cohorts that you need. So I came up with that we would need about 15 cohorts per arm of our study, and thinking that we would have about 8 completers at the end of their follow-up, so about 20% attrition for each one of the cohorts. So participants attended a mean of 6.6 sessions for each of the groups, so that was a relief. You know, people went to our meditation sessions as much as they went to our 10 keys sessions, which was our control group. and there's no way you'll see this font, but we had a slightly small effect at our primary outcome, which I think was at 8 weeks. We had a small effect on our functional outcome, but that was not sustained at 6 months. So, in sample size calculations, I think there's a session coming up about what your statistician needs to know to help you with sample size. So that .02 that I assumed was a total guess. I mean, I did a little bit of work, but it was very hard to find articles that were looking at groups of older adults who had low back pain to see how similar they were over time. So I assumed a .02, and it turned out at the end of the study, and it's actually in our paper, the ICC was actually .02. So as a statistician, you get really excited that I do know what I'm doing, but we actually came in right on. So, they were slightly similar with their outcomes, but fortunately it wasn't more than that. A current study that is under review, we've just finished it, the results have been submitted, is looking at people who have had total knee replacement. And again, this is physical therapy, individualized PT versus going to a community center and participating in older exercise classes for older adults. And we also had a usual care group because in this setting, so these people were in the study 2 to 4 months after their surgery. There is no standard of care, so they're not getting PT any longer. There's really nothing that's recommended. So we felt, this was funded by PCORI, we felt that really was an okay group to have in terms of the usual care for control. And those folks at the end of 6 months could cross over to one of the exercise groups, either physical therapy, or they could get waivers to go to the community centers. Now, for this study, it also turned out, and this was something that, as a study team and the DSMB were keeping an eye on, attendance for the PT sessions was exceptional, and even for the community sessions, that should be community exercise sessions, the median was 19. So we were keeping an eye on attendance. People were doing what they were supposed to do in terms of the protocol intervention. So I'm not going to show you the actual study results since we're not published yet, but hopefully, and I'm sorry that the red line is off, but we went back and actually looked at if people were engaging in exercise outside of what was protocolized with what we had told them to do. And so it turned out that our control group, about 44% of them, although the sample size, we did a 2 to 1 randomization for this study, 44% of the control group were doing exercise more than twice per, at least 30 minutes more than twice per week. And that was statistically significant compared to the 2 intervention groups. So I'm not giving you the results, but it's a little bit of a hint of what we saw. That during this study time, if you've got people who are signing up for a physical therapy, community exercise study, they're probably motivated to do something if you stick them in a usual care group. So, a word of caution. The current study that we have that we just got up and running is funded by the Department of Defense. This is people who are that have sustained a multi-ligament knee injury. So it's interesting, we have our Monday morning meetings and everybody's excited that football season is coming up because we're looking for people with ACL and PCL tears. So it's quite the conversation on Monday morning. So the question here with all of our orthopedic surgeons and PT colleagues is it better to do early surgery, less than 6 weeks from injury, or to really delay surgery and look 3 to 4 months after injury? And also the timing of rehabilitation. So as soon as, a week after surgery, do you start limited range of motion and weight bearing, or do you really put them in a brace and lock them in full extension for, I think, a month? And that's what we're calling delayed. So this was interesting and something that the Department of Defense wanted to fund after we put in a proposal. We also had a planning grant for this study, so there was a lot of work on the research questions. So I'll read this, but we hypothesized that early surgery, early rehabilitation, and the combination of the two will lead to earlier and more complete return to pre-injury. military duty work and sports. And we're also looking at physical function. So those were the investigators' hypotheses when we're planning. So we eventually proposed a 2x2 study, early surgery, delayed surgery. We even discussed, is delayed the right word? Because the patients might not like the word delayed. Like we're putting them off from getting something that they should be getting. And then the early rehab versus the delayed rehab. So that's the study as proposed. And I told you the hypotheses about early. But then we get on the first conference call after the study was funded, and one of the surgeons says, well, I really think delayed is gonna, or delayed and early is gonna work out and be the best group. So in this setting, I really don't think that we have a control group. I think we have some standard practice, which is based on a meeting I had yesterday, is likely the delayed surgery and the delayed rehab might be more of the standard of care. But I think at the end of the day, we'll have to go back to what was the original hypothesis. And it looks like the delayed groups, the marginals, and then that one cell, the 2x2, is really our control group. So this is more of a, just to be funny, so we get to designing this study, and it's a 2x2, and they have to present early enough to get into the early surgery, right? So if you're going to get randomized to early surgery, you have to be less than 6 weeks out from your injury to even be eligible to be randomized. But then we said, well, what if people presented 8 weeks from injury, or 10 weeks from injury, or 24? Well, we want to include them too. So we actually have 2 trials embedded in one. So for people who present past 6 weeks, we'll randomize them, if they agree, to early rehab versus delayed rehab. So this is how a study can grow if you think that the population in the acute group, there might be a bigger population for the delay, or the chronic, sorry. So just briefly, I do want to talk about multimodal interventions. This is something that's come up over the past few years in some studies that I've worked on. When I worked at Carolina's healthcare system, we were always talking about readmissions and what kind of interventions do you do once people are discharged to decrease readmissions. And so a lot of the literature at the time, this is the citation there is our design paper for the trial, but the literature had basically come to the conclusion that there was no silver bullet that was going to fix this, that it really needed to be multiple evidence-based interventions to tackle this problem all at once. And so that's exactly what we did with our study. In light of that, I've also worked with, this is my husband who does research in EMS. He proposed a multimodal intervention looking at decreasing fatigue among paramedics. And you can always get the reviewer who says it will be difficult or impossible to tease out which components are having effects. Well, there's no way that we're going to be able to design a 2x2x2 by 3x2 study to fully look at all the combinations of the interventions that are in his intervention. So, my suggestion to you is if you're going to have a multimodal intervention, to try to have the components of it have some evidence base behind each one, even if they're not strong effects. And then in your proposal, if you're working on a grant application, you have to call attention to the fact that you will not be able to tease out all those effects because the reviewers will be thinking about it. And so just call attention to it and address it right off the bat. And so we did make good arguments why we didn't think that it was feasible to ever tease these out. And he did get a really score, I think he got an 18. And we're right on the funding cusp, so stay tuned. Usual care as a control group, I didn't have time to go through this, and I'm also not an expert in it, but I provide these to you, and hopefully you'll have access to the slides. There are some really thoughtful studies and manuscripts that have been written on usual care in pragmatic trials, in critical care trials, in behavioral interventions. So depending on your area, you could use this as a starting place, but I think if you're going to use usual care as a control group, you need to know what usual care looks like before you start your study. Because if usual care in your sample that you happen to do your study in looks different than what you thought it was going to look, You could have no intervention effect because, for example, you did your usual care at a place that gives top tiered usual care. So we have to be really careful about usual care designs. Before you get started on your non-pharmacological intervention, what do you need to show before proposing your phase 3 NP trial? And there was a really good lecture as one of the webinars on pilot studies. And so, that's a good place to start. But just to show you the LIFE-P study, which was Lifestyle Interventions and Independence for Elders pilot study, and I apologize, I did not put the reference here, but I have it if you would like it. It took 424 people in their pilot study to be able to show that they should move on to their 1,600 person study that had a hard outcome of disability. So there's a lot of work that you have to study before you can say, just like with our exercise study, we can do this in a bigger way. And from a feasibility perspective and short-term outcomes, we think we're on the right path. The consort guidelines, I think, are incredibly helpful when you're developing a protocol, just to make sure that you have all the points addressed. But they've now extended this to non-pharmacological interventions, and I do not expect you to see this, but one of the things that I wanted to highlight is how they've extended it. So this is really important. If you're doing this, just go get their checklist, look at how they've extended it, and anything that they mention, you should be talking about it in your protocol, because you're expected to measure it and know the answers to these things, because you'll be reporting on it. But this, one of the things I've highlighted here, it says precise details of both the experimental treatment and the comparator. So you can't just say usual care is our control. What is that? What do you expect that will actually look like? What are the components? And then one of the things that's come up in our small group and in some of my studies is a description of the procedure for tailoring the interventions to the individual participants. So we'd like to be able to have a checklist to say, do this, do this, do this, this, but there's always going to be a little wiggle room, right? There's always going to be a little tailoring, and how much tailoring was permitted. So there's also adherence not only for the participants to the interventions, but did the providers adhere as well? Sample size, you have to account for clustering, just like with the mindfulness meditation study, or maybe with the pragmatic trial, maybe you had clinics randomized to your intervention, and you have a cluster randomized trial. Blinding is very important. So I work with a wonderful group of physical therapists. We have a physical therapy CTRC, so the Clinical and Translational Research Center. They take blinding very serious. If you have a participant that's being assessed for a walk, so they're looking at gait, they want that person assessed by someone who has never seen that individual exercising at the other end of the clinic. So there's these rolling sheets, that hang down so that everybody can be blinded at all times. And so they take that quite seriously, and it's an important thing that you have to address in your paper. Again, the clustering comes up from a statistical perspective. And in the limitations, you have to actually talk about, did your comparator possibly have an impact on the results that you have? Well, with every single study I've shown you today, our comparator had an impact. And we probably spend the most time in the study design on the comparator. I would love to have a placebo-controlled trial. It seems like it'd be fairly, I know finding dose is hard, but a placebo-controlled trial seems pretty straightforward compared to some of the stuff that comes through my door. And then I think importantly here, the generalizability with respect to the comparators, the providers. So in our exercise study, we did train people for, I think, up to 3 to 4 weeks on the treadmill. It was walking. We had to just make sure that they could get to the intensity, they knew how to use a heart rate monitor, and that they were safe. But most of them, I think 88% of them exercised at a gym or at home. So in terms of how generalizable are our results, we think they're pretty generalizable, although people were recruited from, high-level academic medical centers, so to think about that. I think that's it. That's Pittsburgh when the sun was shining. I'm assuming it was sometime in the summer, so it's pretty gray there. But thank you, and if you have any questions, particularly in the next few days, please feel free to have a meeting with me.
I think we have time for a question or two from the audience, and then we'll work. Hopefully people have seen where their small groups are.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. So $14 million seems like an unreasonable budget for a phase
Just
2, so to speak, trial, but behavioral interventions are expensive. What is a reasonable budget for an early phase behavioral intervention? I know there's not a single answer to that, but sort of what's the range that I should be thinking about as reasonable?
I can tell you with Sparks, we scaled it down. It went in as an R01. I don't know what the final budget was, maybe 2.5, 3 or 1 million. We were under budget. Every site had people that were pitching in effort from their departmental chair saying it's okay for you to work on this. Even as the statistician, I was working on this study after the funding was gone. So don't sell yourself too short. If you need it, you can always ask permission as long as it's justified. So if you're going to go over $500,000 per year direct cost, you can request approval to do so.
Thanks a lot for this talk. So when you said the factorial design was dismissed and being said, it was small and underpowered for efficacy. So I could understand aim 1 where it was more like a feasibility question.
It was, right.
Can you explain aim 2 again? I didn't understand the futility or design part.
So the futility design was really meant to say, does this warrant further investigation? So it borrowed heavily off of the oncology trials that are set up in phase 2, where you're trying to screen. The goal is not to show this has enough that we should go forward, like efficacy, short-term efficacy, but the goal is really to weed out things that should not be pushed further. And you have to set a threshold, so you have to decide what's the difference that's meaningful. So ours was around 3.5 on the UPDRS motor score, similar to what phase 3 studies were being powered on, sample size. But the goal is a little different, that null and alternative hypotheses get flipped around and you have to just stare at it and study it for a while. But the goal is really to weed out things that should not be studied further. And there's some really great papers out of MUSC and some really good phase 2 studies that have been funded by NINDS that have a lot of detail on futility, phase 2 futility design.
It's set up a little bit like a non-inferiority study, in that if you're in this range, then you're in sort of a zone of promise. And if you're not, and it looks like everything is really overlying, it's to give you that goalpost of, should I move on to the next study? So if things look like there's really no chance you're going to show your minimally scientifically important difference in the next study, then you stop at that study. But yeah, there are lots of good references on that. Any other questions?